Okay, and now to the announcement of our speaker. We are very, very pleased and happy to host Ben Williamson today. Ben Williamson is a Chancellor's Fellow at Edinburgh University. He works in the Centre for Research in Digital Education, and he's the editor of Learning Media and Technology Journal, as well as the author of the excellent book, Big Data in Education, The Digital Future of Learning Policy and Practice. I should say that Ben is one of the leading global scholars on education technology and everything digital in education. So we are really pleased that you're with us, Ben. Thank you so much. And you will talk today about pandemic privatization through online learning platforms. So Ben has been working on privatization, especially in the digital world of education, for quite many years, and has not missed the opportunity to follow the effects of the pandemic on this really lively dynamic. So Ben has recently done two projects, also for Education International, monitoring closely what's been happening through the pandemic. So we're really looking forward to your talk, Ben. As I said before, if people want to ask questions, feel free to post in the chat area throughout the talk, and I will try to collate everything later. You can also just comment or share your thoughts. So do use the chat area. So Ben will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will open the floor to discussion. So thank you very much, Ben, and now over to you.
Okay, so I'm hoping everybody can hear me, and we will just get going. Okay, thanks everybody who's come along. I'm really pleased to have been invited to host this webinar on pandemic privatization through online learning platforms. Now, of course, processes of privatization and commercialization and marketization in higher education are not new, of course. And nor really is the rollout and the uptake of online learning platforms, which span back at least 10 years to the kind of explosion of MOOCs and sometime before that too. But this past year, as we've all experienced firsthand, this year of disruption has, I think, rapidly amplified and accelerated a whole bunch of privatization and platformization tendencies. So in the first instance, of course, as we all experienced, new educational technologies and platforms for video conferencing and lecture delivery and online forums for keeping in contact with our students and so on, sort of introduced at speed as emergency relief from campus closures. But then they were positioned as kind of like engines of a kind of post-pandemic reimagining and even a kind of reconstruction of higher education too. And it's that kind of the longer term trajectories that we now appear to be on in a kind of, you know, in the midst of, but hopefully heading towards a kind of post-pandemic period. As Janja said, the talk is partly based on one of the projects that I've been working on with Anna Hogan at the University of Queensland, funded by Education International, on private and commercial activity in education during the pandemic and what those developments and trends suggest for policy and practice in the future. So I'm hoping to follow some of those trajectories and partially begin to sort of conceptualize what's going on, and I'll do that in a number of stages. And I hope by the end to say a little something about what I think these developments illustrate in terms of emerging forms of digital power and even statecraft. Just very briefly to situate myself in relation to all the work that's gone before. There are kind of three literatures I'm drawing on. One is the sort of the education policy literature that is particularly focused on the ways in which private and commercial actors have participated in sort of multi-sector networks and various forms of public-private partnerships to kind of exert influence in different ways over state education systems. And particular emphasis, of course, today is on the kind of education and technology actors that have begun to participate more in the provision of education services, which we might otherwise think of as normally being provided by the state. And part of this literature on sort of privatisation of education, or particularly in this one text, is focused on how emergencies often produce catalytic opportunities for kind of market-oriented privatisation policies and reforms in education. So it's this idea of a kind of catalytic opportunity for some form of policy change and reform that I'm focusing on here. And that set of emergency or catalytic opportunities for emergency reform is then refracted through the rapid amplification of platforms in education. Now, there are multiple sorts of platforms way beyond education, of course. So we have platforms like Facebook and Amazon and YouTube and Spotify and all the rest. And part of the argument made by people like Jose van Dijk and her colleagues is that they have begun to quite profoundly shape our societies and the way we live our social lives and the way we think about what constitutes kind of different forms of publics and so on. And platforms have a number of distinct kind of mechanisms, all of which we'll see in this presentation. Some of those are about datafication, kind of rendering of everything as digital information. Then aspects of commodification, turning every object, every interaction, people's ideas, the content they produce, their conversations with one another into some kind of tradable commodity or an asset, perhaps, if you like. And then thirdly, the third key mechanism is about the selection or the personalization of the kind of content or material you see on a platform. And again, we'll see some evidence of kind of platform personalization in the material I'm going to go through today. And there are two specific sorts of platforms that Van Dijk and colleagues specify. That you've got sectoral platforms that work in specific sectors, and increasingly in what we would usually consider the public sectors, sectors like health and education. So we have kind of bespoke sector-specific platforms, often provided by private technology companies, sort of semi-privatization of state services. But these kinds of platforms are also then undergirded by infrastructural platforms. So these are the kind of global scale technical infrastructures of cloud storage and all of the kind of analytics machinery on which the other platforms depend for their operation. So we're looking at these two different sorts of sectoral and infrastructural platforms as well. And then the third literature I want to draw on, and again, just very quite briefly here, is the literature on markets, largely drawn from economics, sociology. So my key point here is that processes of privatization or platformization as well Okay, so hopefully you can hear me. So I had got as far as talking about my attempt to engage with some of this market sociology work, economic sociology. And the real emphasis I want to put on here are the particular kinds of methods, the devices, and the technologies that are used to construct particular markets around private platform providers. And I'll give some detail of the sorts of things I mean as we go through. So these kind of three sets of concerns around privatization platforms and markets, I think, have become peculiarly conjoined during this particular sort of pandemic period. And that's been recognized in work in other sectors, particularly those working in health, in this particular book, which focuses on issues such as the idea of disaster techno-capitalism and the rise of digital pandemic governance and technological solutionism during the particular emergency period. So all of the contributions to this particular book here are focusing on the increased penetration of big technology providers into public life and into health, work, and the education sectors. Firstly, as kind of emergency relief, but then again as kind of long-term reformatory models. That stands to potentially profoundly alter social and public life in ways that it might actually be incredibly difficult to challenge. Okay, so I want to work through what I see as kind of 5 interlocking kind of processes of what I'm calling this kind of pandemic privatization in higher education. The first one is around policy problematization, or the crafting of particular kinds of problems in ways which makes them amenable to certain sorts of solutions. So I think we've seen a great deal of activity from various different sectoral positions to construct higher education as a kind of problem sector in some particular way. So we've seen arguments coming from the likes of the World Economic Forum, or published in the Harvard Business Review, that higher education has experienced kind of historical stasis, that it's remained unchanged, and that it requires some kind of long overdue change and revolution to address problems like student employability and earnings and a so-called skills gap, that there are issues around access and inclusion, particularly for non-traditional or distance students. There are issues around the boosting of human capital in relation to automation and the so-called 4th industrial revolution. And then there are problems around, well, what would economic recovery look like post-COVID, and what kind of graduates will we need to address that? And all of these problems have been framed in the kinds of texts you can see on the screen here as being amenable to forms of technological experimentation and even solution. So this kind of this crafting of problems, or higher education as a kind of problem sector in a particular way, is the kind of the first stage of this pandemic privatization. That's then followed by the introduction of particular kind of proposals for technological solutions, many of which were proposed as initial emergency relief measures, and then as kind of templates for larger scale and longer term reforms. And we see this kind of repeated, I suppose, mantra at the moment of digital transformation, both as it's kind of introduced in a kind of experimental way. In the short term, we need digital transformation now, because otherwise millions of students aren't going to be able to access their materials. But we also need digital transformation for the much longer term. And we can see how a range of primarily external actors to the sector, like consultancies and international organizations and businesses themselves, have produced these kinds of arguments and kind of reformatory kind of imaginaries for how to remake or reimagine higher education. And these respond to the problems that I indicated on the previous slide, but also offer particular kinds of solutions. So this would involve much more enhanced digital delivery. It would involve more datafication or monitoring and tracking of student activities to generate insights into what they're doing and how they are learning or how they're studying, what their outcomes are, and also involve a kind of unbundling of the degree to a variety of market providers, including the use of artificial intelligence for selecting or personalizing learning, all of which would be done on the kinds of platforms that private technology providers are best placed to provide, because higher education institutions belong to a problem sector that has remained wedded to kind of conservative or traditional models of teaching and learning. So we have this kind of, in response to the problems, proposals for these kinds of solutions. Sorry, lots of text on this one, but I wanted to give you some sort of tangible sense of the ways in which these imaginaries of sort of technical solutions to higher education are being presented to us as a sector by organizations that sort of are supposed to support us. So this is part of JISC's Learning and Teaching Reimagined program. There's multiple different strands of this, including some specific scenarios and visioning documents. And in particular, this report that's at the top of the screen, A New Dawn for Higher Education, which was published just a little earlier this month. So we get some sense here, I think, of this kind of imaginary of digital transformation sort of exemplified on the page. I've highlighted a few of the sort of the key words here. It's around digital acceleration, a revolution. Universities that fail to adapt and reimagine themselves as digital organizations may see their appeal diminish and their business come under pressure. This is about advancing to a new digital future and bringing that digital future to a complete reality. This vision's forming. We have ingenuity and drive in the sector to design, develop, and deliver it. And then it suggests some particular ways in which that future might be delivered through new and emerging technologies, including AI, mixed reality, robotics, data standards for the interchange of learning data, wider use of micro-credentials, new forms of assessment, and even the development of well-being analytics to study students' social and emotional health. So I see this as kind of exemplifying this presentation of technological solutions. So one might argue, as David Kernahan did at Wonky, that what this largely seems to bypass are the kind of larger social, economic, political, the structural issues that affect how universities operate and how students do and how they progress and so on. And also ignores the very real local and cultural context in which universities and their students are situated, which might demand a variety of quite different approaches. The third kind of interlocking part of pandemic privatisation is then the making of education technology markets in quite specific ways, which I'm just beginning to really tease out. So what we can see is that various different proposed technological solutions utterly depend on the creation of particular kind of market conditions in which technology providers, vendors can thrive and seek and gain investment, which allows them to develop products which might then be rolled out and scaled up and so on. So the relationship between the technologies themselves and the markets, I think, is they're utterly in parallel and depend upon one another. Now, we've seen the rise in activity of a number of different sort of financial valuation and investment actors focusing on education technology markets over recent months, who are focusing particularly on what are the kind of returns available for investors in education technology, and the kinds of kind of valuations that are being made here about education technology also depend on very specific kinds of methods and devices and activities. And you can see some of that in these two examples here from Credit Suisse. One is at the bottom, a piece of partner content it published in the Financial Times, where it describes education as having a Netflix moment. So it's the kind of the promise of, you know, a huge high value type company thriving in education in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. You've kind of got the imagery here of the small girl on the kind of Zoom meeting as part of this kind of imaginary represented. And then in the document above it, Credit Suisse actually has as part of its asset management portfolio, actually runs an equity fund called runs an edutainment equity fund for the digital transformation of education. And again, you can see some of the imagery here of the kind of high-tech virtual reality goggles type future that apparently goes with the digital transformation of education. So it's got a fund as a particular kind of device or a way of generating investment in the kinds of education technology companies which it's assumed will deliver this kind of imaginary of digital transformation, if only they are invested in. Investment will, as it were, make this future possible. I want to look at one particular financial organization just in a tiny bit more detail. Many of you may have come across Holland Iq in the last couple of years. They were only established in 2018 as a education market intelligence agency whose various different visualizations and financial and market forecasts seem to be increasingly relied upon by a whole range of different types of organizations. And I see what Holland Iq doing is both kind of cataloging where education technology markets are and utilize them to develop and grow in value in the future. So Holland Iq describes itself as the backbone of strategy planning for education institutions, for tech companies, for government departments and education investors who rely on it for a variety of key business functions, including market metrics, market dynamics, and market access. We can see one of its devices on the screen here, this global learning landscape, a kind of massive catalogue or taxonomy of what Holland Iq has determined to be valuable education technology providers. There are something like 300 plus on this screen alone, segmented up according to a variety of different a variety of different categories. So Holland Iq, it deploys various different techniques, different practices and devices to kind of turn education technology into valuable objects, market segments that might be invested in both by investors and invested in by users and customers in institutions. There's just a few examples of the sorts of things they do. Holland Iq makes a variety of kind of valuation claims. So it claims that the online degree market will be worth $74 billion by 2025, based on current trends. Makes a valuation claim that the global online program management and academic public-private partnership market is worth $7 billion as a segment of that. So those are some of the claims. Some of the specific devices it uses include these visualizations and infographics, kind of represent market fluctuations and kind of produce conviction in others that education technology is a valuable area of investment. And one of the key devices is something that we can't see because it's hidden in the background. It's Holland Iq's proprietary cloud-based education market intelligence platform, which it describes as a kind of hybrid human, non-human type arrangement. It's got machine learning and absolutely massive edtech market data sets. And it's then got the kind of human smarts of its own intelligence unit, which are working together to produce these kind of market valuations and claims. Other things that Holland Iq does, it's actually become an investor or a partner in education technology investment through a partnership with RISE, which you can see in the top corner. So RISE has recently launched a kind of portfolio fund, enabling investors to invest in a kind of like a basket of different education technology companies. That basket is based on valuation claims made by Holland Iq, which has compiled the basket based on what it assesses to be some of the top performing education technology companies. So that's one of its devices. And one of the others is the bottom, the Higher Education Digital Capability Framework, which is targeted at the other end of the market, not at investors who invest in terms of providing funding, but investors in terms of customers, institutional leaders, IT procurement staff, and so on, who are making purchases and investing in particular products based on kind of advice and guidance that this framework ostensibly provides. This is just a little more from the RISE Education Technology Fund, the portfolio fund that I mentioned a moment ago, that Holland Iq is a partner with. It presents favorable growth prospects, apparently, through exposure to ed tech companies that are redefining how education is accessed, resourced, and consumed around the world. You can see that Holland Iq is the kind of power behind that particular fund, based on its proprietary classification system of companies that are market leaders in digital and lifelong learning technologies. So the particular infographics I showed a slide or two back is based on this classification system. So that classification system of the kind of the top performers in the education technology market becomes part of the kind of the machinery for this fund itself. So Holland Iq is not just cataloging the market, it's catalyzing market activity too in a variety of different ways. It's empowering investment decisions, it's empowering institutional strategies, and it's also empowering the asset managers who look after these particular funds to present themselves as new authorities in education technology, gathering funding towards these high value organizations which are going to deliver allegedly this digital transformation of higher education. So we might say, if we were following the kind of economic sociology line, that this is a kind of configuration of new education realities through the very specific ways in which market making and kind of capitalization of education technology products is done. Okay, moving on. So we've reached now the particular kinds of platforms that are enabled by all of the kind of all of the previous problematization, imagining, and market making. So what gets invested in, what then gets enacted in practices, what gets scaled out, and so on. And here we have a range of increasingly highly capitalized but also competing private education technology companies who are providing learning platform provision, but also kind of global scale cloud and data infrastructure providers too, who are all extending at the moment, or seeking to extend into education. And in the process, I tried to argue here, the kind of re-infrastructuring higher education by integrating the physical infrastructure of the campus or the buildings and the lecture theatres and seminar rooms and so on, integrating all of that with digital infrastructure. That is kind of integrating the campus with the cloud to develop this kind of university of the future, as the consultancy group Ernst Young recently described it. I'll give again some examples of this. So we have the emergence of a range of different sectoral platforms to specifically deliver online learning. These existed before, but they've experienced significant growth and expansion over the last 9 or 10 months or so, 11 months is it now. These kinds of organizations, online learning platform organizations, kind of present themselves in the language of large-scale computing and through the deployment of the very technologies of the technology sector, as I suppose you'd expect. The language here is kind of interesting. 2UOS is an operating system to deliver, or a proprietary operating system to seamlessly build, deliver, and support the offerings we power online learning. Noodle is a new kind of education network which brings together a variety of components to enable universities to offer what it describes as increasingly kind of cloud hosted, hybrid, smart, technologically empowered and unbundled sorts of programs. So there's something going on here, I think, around the kind of the a certain form of outsourcing or the development of new kinds of public-private partnerships in higher education. Most of these kind of online program management platforms, they form into partnerships with higher education institutions. They provide upfront funding to the institution to help develop online programs, but then they have a revenue sharing agreement, which means they take 50 to 60% of the student fees, as well as ongoing management fees thereafter. So we have these kinds of organizations now as public-private or private partners in public-private partnerships with universities, providing the platform underlay that enables teaching and learning to take place. And some of these organizations are fast expanding beyond the kind of the core offer of the learning platform itself to provide a whole kind of stack of services. And the example I'm using here is Noodle, It's a sector specific platform which is expanding to more like infrastructural operations over every stage of the student life cycle. So it both integrates a university's existing information and data and learning management systems, as well as a range of third-party plugins, and it outsources other core tasks to other service providers, which can join the stack, as it were. And what it's also doing is it's proposing that it can run a whole bunch of functions that we'd normally expect a university to run for itself. So it provides a particular kind of business model, it takes responsibility for marketing and recruitment, it deals with all of the various different flows of data and interoperability issues across a wide variety of different applications and platforms. And it also participates in learning design and faculty support. So it's actually going far from being the kind of the platform on which learning takes place to actually being a participant in the development of those of the particular kind of pedagogy and the organization of curriculum as a kind of designer of learning. And its ultimate aim is to create what it calls the agile campus. This is the digital transformation of higher education writ large, a new kind of campus that's hybrid, on campus and off campus, in the cloud, all powered by the Noodle core and the stack of services that it facilitates. Another example is Coursera. Coursera is best known as a MOOC that did very well in 2012 and so on, and has, I believe, sort of tried to work out different ways in which its business can really operate in between times. But it experienced something like 600% growth in enrollments in March this year alone, and that was partly because it began offering this Coursera for Campus offering. So actually partnering with universities at the time for free to provide bundles of ready-made courses that universities could then offer to their students in lieu of an existing kind of bundle of ready-made online learning provision. So Coursera for Campus did very well. From this, it's now looking to a different fee model. So universities will pay to participate in Coursera for Campus to deliver teaching and learning where the institution itself can't. So you can see from the infographic, again, it's kind of got a huge number of university partners and courses with different specializations. There are two particular interesting things here. I think one is the shift in emphasis that comes with a platform like this to the idea that the ultimate purpose of a higher education is around job relevance, which you can see in the screenshot here, that everything should be career driven and skills focused, again, sort of delivering the skills of the future to an increasingly diverse range of students who haven't been well serviced by the kind of normal brick and mortar campus, or at least that's the kind of the problematization that Coursera is then offering a solution to. And the second interesting thing, which then reinforces the first, is just the huge quantity of data that Coursera has been able to compile from 8 years worth of enrollments, which total 200 million different enrollments, and involves the collection by Coursera of 0.5 petabyte of traffic per month. So I think a petabyte has got 15 zeros on it. So it's an awful lot of data from every log on, click, from every video that a student has watched, from the time spent on each screen. There's a metric for how much time a student actually spends on each video resource and so on. So in the kind of background report, you can see all the various different dozens of metrics that Coursera uses to monitor and assess and evaluate what students are doing. And what it can do with that data then is it can present it as evidence of its particular impact. So in the sort of paraphrasing in the bottom bullet point there, you can see that what Coursera has been doing is data mining all of those student data using proprietary algorithms for what it calls skill scoring and career impact, to provide actionable data-driven insights into how instructors and learners can optimize their digital learning experience. So Coursera has really become a kind of an authority in its own right on kind of what works in digital teaching and learning. Just very briefly, a platform like Coursera cannot exist without background, large-scale, global operations infrastructure. So Coursera, as you can see in the quotation here from one of its software engineers, cannot exist without Amazon Web Services. We rely on AWS every single day for the speed, service, agility, and scale required to serve our students worldwide, and to provide deeper insights into student learning that would not be possible without AWS. So in the graphic, you can see some of the components of the AWS kind of infrastructure that comes if you use AWS as the system for hosting your platform. It integrates together a whole bunch of different AWS storage and analytics functionality and crawlers and sort of glue to knit these things together. It links out to dashboards and other sorts of tools. It connects via VPN to the student information system and so on. So we now have organizations like AWS and these vast sort of global infrastructures becoming embedded in the back end of higher education, and not just through platforms like Coursera, but increasingly as an offer directly to universities. So this is just from September. AWS rather, launched a pricing program for AWS storage so that institutions can build data lakes of massive volumes of heterogeneous data and then run different types of analytics, from dashboards and visualizations to big data processing, real-time analytics and machine learning, to guide better decisions, track student performance and course details, and enrollment numbers to help determine which courses need to be redesigned. So these kinds of organizations, AWS and Microsoft and Google and Salesforce and the other kind of big infrastructure providers, I think are now increasingly in a kind of competition for infrastructural dominance over higher education data storage and analytics, and they're increasingly looking to kind of undergird all that goes on in the kind of digital transformation of the university. Right, so I've reached the fifth and final kind of interlocking component that I wanted to go through, and this is much more briefly about the ways in which some of these developments are then normalized. So I think some of the kind of the period of emergency experimentation is now being translated into more like kind of forms of realization that are being recognized at a political or policy level, that things are being, these kind of long-standing imaginaries of digital transformation are being made to seem inevitable and also imperative. And this can maybe be explained by the work of Anthony Verger and colleagues on educational privatisation in emergency situations, where they say that policymakers and other actors are more open to considering drastic policy changes when such changes are framed and perceived as inherent to the reconstruction process that follows a particular kind of emergency. And I've just got two very brief examples where I think some of this normalization is beginning to occur. One is at the Office for Students, which is currently running a kind of review of the evidence on digital teaching and learning in English higher education during the pandemic. So it's both considering things that worked and didn't. But I suppose what's interesting here is that there is this recourse to the idea of what works in relation to digital teaching and learning, but also, and more significantly, there's a desire in this particular review from the outset to identify what worked and then what can be continued and delivered at scale in the future. It talks of opportunities that digital teaching and learning present in the medium to longer term. I think there's a kind of this sense that what we've experienced over the last months in a kind of emergency is presenting opportunities for inevitable and indeed imperative type changes, and that's kind of taken for granted. And the final example is again from the JISC Teaching and Learning Reimagined program, which has just last month presented a strategy framework for university leaders, very much focused on the idea that universities will have a digital core. So it calls for universities to invest in digital infrastructure to become data empowered. It talks of all of the different kinds of interoperability protocols that would enable data to flow between formally compartmentalized applications of exactly the kind that AWS and others like it are promising. It talks of new kinds of information networks with their own augmented intelligence. And it also kind of employs the model or the template of the big, high value, big tech organizations as a model for what a digital transformation in higher education would look like. Netflix, Apple, and Uber apply data-driven decisions and provide dynamic experiences based on an individual consumer's information. This is the logic of datafication and personalization and selection actually now being pushed to university leaders in this country. This is about applying the design principles of Netflix and Apple and Uber and Amazon and so on to higher education to transform how learning, teaching, research, and professional services are experienced. So I think we see here a kind of normalization, a stabilization of the idea of digital transformation as a kind of, as an inevitable, an imperative strategy for the post-pandemic university. I said at the outset I wanted to try and finish with just a few comments on what all of this might say about contemporary forms of power and statecraft. And it's partly due to reading a couple of very recent papers that haven't at all been higher education focused, but have sought to try and grapple with contemporary issues of the kind of the digital statecraft and new forms of power or emerging forms of power that have been long building, but seem to have become particularly kind of visible and intensive at the current time. So what I'm tentatively suggesting is that these kind of digital transformations, which I'm trying to map out in higher education specifically, seem to exemplify a shift to what Marianne Fourcade and Jeff Gordon have described as an emerging form of digital statecraft. So they talk about statecraft as the state's mode of learning about society and then intervening in it. And they suggest that shifts in the way that states use technology herald deeper transformations in these forms of statecraft. But then they say, in the kind of current digital context, states don't have their own kind of infrastructural technical capacity to learn about and intervene in their subjects of government. So they therefore have to engage in more and more public-private partnerships and outsourcing agreements to private technology providers who can provide that infrastructure. And then they say the result of this is a certain kind of downgrading of the state as the legitimate producer of informational truth and the takeover of traditional state functions by a small corporate elite. And I think there's more to explore here about the ways in which all of the various different platform and infrastructure providers that I've tried to describe in this talk might now be seen as increasingly the legitimate producers of informational truth. And I think we see that reflected in the kind of the kind of documents that JISC and other consultancies are producing. We need to use the same design principles of the big private technology providers as a way of generating a kind of informational truth about students. So Foucault and Gordon describe a contemporary dataist state where the goals and means of public governance are outsourced to algorithms and private contractors, which aim to create value and profit from new ways of knowing and sensing. And then that, I think, connects to this paper. It's also very recent, from Einstein and Rupert, on what they call the birth of sensory power, which they say has become increasingly visible during the particular pandemic, though it has longer roots. But they talk about sensory power as a form of sort of contemporary power and control that is connected with the rise of machine learning and sort of artificial intelligence and datafication and so on. So they suggest there's been a shift beyond the periodic stock taking of statistics, where statistics captured survey and census data about the activities of populations. And they say now these contemporary forms of sensory power can mobilize machine learning to detect signals and trace patterns, pulses, and flows that make people sensible from their real-time digital performance traces. And all of this relies on a specific kind of apparatus of technologies and practices and agencies and so on, which then produce a new form of live governing of the performance of forms of embodied conduct and behavior. I think perhaps we can see these forms of sensory power coming through in exactly the kinds of platforms and infrastructural arrangements that I've been trying to map out in this presentation. And I'll finish with this example from Salesforce, partly because Salesforce is the technical partner on the JISC Digital to the Core Imagining Higher Education 2030 strategy, and because Salesforce offers this particular education data architecture as part of its broader education cloud program. And again, this is very much about making students sensible. It's about gaining a 360-degree view of every learner in real time, constantly, and then using the same kind of underlying technologies of Amazon One Click, of Spotify recommendations, or the Apple Watch's health tracking for specific higher education reasons. And part of this particular architecture for making students sensible is then a kind of more interventionist application, which it calls Einstein. And Einstein is Salesforce's AI. So Einstein for Education Cloud enables education institutions to predict future student outcomes, access intelligent recommendations, and automate tasks and workflows across campuses to drive student success. So it's not just about sensing students, but about then live intervention in what they do through increasingly automated technologies. Okay, I probably horribly overran my time, especially with the delay earlier on. But what I hope I've at least begun to illustrate tentatively and kind of feeling my way with some of this, and I welcome your feedback in a moment. But I think there's something here about these digital transformations in higher education exemplifying these kind of shifts in digital statecraft and power through making students sensible, predictable, and in fact actionable. And that's increasingly and indeed only possible through the kinds of analytics and cloud storage and so on that's provided through private platforms and infrastructures. So to come back to my title around pandemic privatisation, I think what we can see here, and I hope I've begun to illustrate, is a kind of process of perhaps partial privatisation or privatisations of particular aspects of higher education that involve different forms of problem making, of technological solutions, proposals of markets, of kind of competition between platforms and infrastructure providers, and lastly, this kind of normalization of digital transformation as a model of post-pandemic universities. I thank you very much, and I guess we'll take some questions and some discussion. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben, for this really excellent and intriguing talk. There was a lot of discussion in the chat area throughout your talk, and you really raised good reactions and already some discussion. So if people want to switch on their cameras and if you want to come into the discussion, please feel free to do so. So either raise your hand, virtual hand, or switch on your camera and wave, or just keep posting in the chat area. Don't be shy using the camera. It's just, at the moment, it's just me and Ben. Anyway, there are a few groups of questions and comments that came out of the chat discussion. And one really big issue is around the data privacy and just the relationships between these different actors, so universities when they connect with different companies, how is the data privacy then handled? By this, I mean data privacy of students, staff, etc. Just how is all of this sorted? And can we trust for-profit interests of private companies, and basically just what's going on there? You know, what do we know about this, and how do you see this issue? So I'll just let you answer this, and then I have a lot more to ask and comment.
Yeah. So data privacy and protection issue is huge. I would hope that all institutions are developing robust data policies with inbuilt protections, but my sense is that we would need, thinking as researchers, to do some kind of empirical study of how particular kind of data privacy protection and ethics statements are being generated, and whether they're consistent with one another, or what the key kind of aspects of those are. Also, I suspect, though I don't know, that an awful lot of organizations are struggling with this. You know, the complexities of GDPR are such that it requires extraordinary forms of expertise, which some institutions may not have. There was a really good piece in, I think, the Chronicle of Higher Education a week or two ago by Bonnie Stewart in the States, who was really arguing that the sector as a whole, and she's talking to the US primarily, really needs to band together to demand better statements of data ethics, because universities are being sort of distributed across a whole range of platforms and different infrastructure providers, many of which have their own records, some not great records in relation to privacy and protections and so on. So I think there's a kind of growing groundswell of kind of critical and slightly activist scholarship sort of demanding action in this particular place. And if you work at an institution where you don't feel that's happening, then maybe work with unions perhaps to try and resolve that. But yeah, it's going to need working out at individual institutional scales, but there also needs to be something larger to help institutions.
Thanks, Ben. I'm now contemplating whether I can share my thoughts about this as well or not, because there's so many questions.
Yeah, good for it.
But maybe just to say that about data privacy, we should also realize that it is addressing, the GDPR is the most developed framework in the world, and it is addressing only personally identifiable data. So de-identifiable data is freely shared, metadata is shared, and so on. And even the identifiable data is shared if the appropriate contracts are in place. So we're seeing kind of nestedness of contractual relations between universities and these companies, and there's a real conundrum going on there. There's, as you say, there's something written in general, mainly in STS and also legal scholars. So if anyone is interested in that, I really advise them to look at that literature. Thanks. Then there's a question about just what is inside and outside of the sector. So someone said that FutureLearn, for example, is associated to Open University, edX to MIT, and a lot of policy ideas come from these kind of platforms that are somehow at least originated within the higher education sector. So the question is really, what can we consider as ideas and proposals, actions even, coming from inside the sector versus the private?
Yeah, well, it's increasingly blurry, isn't it? And organizations like Holland Iq are key in blurring those lines and seemingly demonstrating to both private investors and institutions that are notionally part of the public sector, that there is value to be had in various different ways from working together. So it's always been difficult to entirely separate sort of the public and the private, the inside and the outside of the higher education sector, because they are so porous in multiple different ways. Somebody shared with me yesterday the results of I think it was a survey by Tony Blair's Global Foundation, and it was on public perceptions of the role of private technology companies in various different sort of public services, and it seemed to suggest that there was an overwhelming perception that that private technology companies could be hugely beneficial to improving education. So I think there's also a kind of public perception that higher education does need to engage with these private actors more, and that the value of organizations like AWS and whoever else can add to the value of higher education. So there are multiple, I think, different kind of hybridities, public-private partnerships. Then there are the kind of multi-sector policy networks, which make it very difficult to disentangle the kind of the inside and the outside. But it seems to me that most of the proposals for change are coming from actors which we would conventionally consider external to the sector, that they are being generated in places like the big consultancies, in think tanks, in international organizations like the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and so on, that these are kind of being shared in networks with some of the very businesses who might benefit from these kinds of changes, but that some of the proposals aren't necessarily coming from inside, or they are coming from particular positions within the inside of the sector. So the GISC report and project that I mentioned a couple of times has engaged extensively with vice chancellors who are a particular set of or grouping within the sector, whose decisions don't always rub well with staff in either academic or professional services positions. So it does make it increasingly tricky to sort of identify where solutions are coming from inside and where others are coming from the outside.
Yeah, thanks. I see, Daniel, you have a hand up. I will just ask one question first, and then I will give the floor to you, so that it's not only the two of us speaking. But since you just mentioned GISC, there was also a discussion in the chat area. Someone attended yesterday's event hosted by Wonky, where David Maguire from GISC claimed that people are first, people are more important, and technology is secondary. So, just a discursive kind of construction of what GISC communicates as a priority. And then on the other hand, Paul is asking a question. It feels like the claims of these companies are being taken at face value. Of course, they want to foreground their power and potential, but most of these seem very overstated and not that different from previous available mechanisms. Are we in danger of believing the hype? And maybe I can just add the third kind of comment, which was also that in some parts of the world, there are claims by individuals and some politicians and so on against universities and staff as being non-qualified and prepared to embrace, the digital as well as deliver kind of their work in the modern times. So it seems like we have really different discursive constructions. How do you, as a researcher, kind of grapple with that of what are the material effects, I guess?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that we shouldn't necessarily believe the hype. It's partly why I talk about things in terms of sort of imaginaries. What's often interesting to me as a researcher is what do organizations and authorities of various different kinds want to happen, and the reality will always turn out rather differently. There's no policy or technical invention ever delivers in quite the way that it was perhaps intended or expected to do. However, what I think we can often see is kind of partial instantiations. So we see the ways in which particular kind of imaginaries then feed into the way that particular organizations or sort of financial organizations then invest in particular companies, which enables them to develop programs or applications which they are then able to deliver to the market. So these aren't kind of ideal. These aren't the kind of the ideal type realizations that that they might have been intended as, but they are sort of partial materializations of those imaginaries. But so yeah, so we should certainly challenge the hype, but also increasingly get really empirical about tracing out which aspects of these intended interventions bear certain kinds of effects, and those effects might be slightly surprising and unexpected. They might not be quite as transformative as hoped. And of course, I think you said it was Paul asked the question. Of course, there's a long history, a really long history of these kind of transformational discourses. But I think that the slight difference now is this kind of opening up of an opportunity that never seemed possible before, and the fact that there seems to be increasing consensus that these are desirable ways forward. And it's that kind of consensus across governmental and sort of think tank and consultancy fields and international organizations that I think will enable more of the kind of partial materialization of these imaginaries than perhaps was possible before. But we need to get really empirical on tracing what those materializations and their effects are.
Yeah, thank you. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you very much. Firstly, I've put forward something really interesting talk. And I should, just in the interest of full disclosure, say I do work in the for-profit education sector, so I probably have a slightly different perspective to some of the others. But from that, I guess there is a critique of universities that says, education is broken, it's not fit for purpose, it must be fixed, and there is that around. There is a sort of milder critique, which is maybe that perhaps universities have been a bit slow adopting some of the opportunities of new technology and, haven't, made the most of it for themselves and taken that into their own hands, possibly resulting in now some of the pressure to kind of, have it done to them, for want of a better term, by sort of external companies. And I guess just as a small example of that I was mentioning is that, like, talks like this are now routinely sort of done over Zoom, which means that more people can participate. And for someone like me doing a distance learning PhD, it's great because can tap into all this sort of thing. And there's been a lot more of that since the pandemic than there was before. Before it tended to be very kind of campus focused, and that was the mindset. So I suppose one of my questions was, do you have any sympathy with that critique? Do you think there's something behind that sort of milder version? And do you think there is scope for universities to kind of take it more into their own hands to respond and to kind of take control of how they use technology?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Daniel. So yeah, well, yeah, perhaps many educators haven't seen the kind of the need to take the tech into their own hands. And some, of course, have. I mean, I'm not disputing that there's been really interesting work with digital technology in universities. I work in a centre at the University of Edinburgh where we do all of our teaching online. In actual fact, I will be teaching online after this session. We do it through Moodle and we do it on Twitter, and we do video stuff. So, but that program, which I take no credit for developing because I didn't, I arrived after it all been developed, was very much educator led. My colleagues wrote a book about it that just came out called the Manifesto for Teaching Online. It very much challenges the kind of the commercial ed tech argument that that universities need are disruptive and transformative intervention. It says actually to develop meaningful online courses requires conversations about meaningful pedagogy. It requires conversations about what is the actual added value or benefit of delivering teaching and learning online and mediated through various different technical platforms and so on. So I can see the huge benefits of that, particularly, as you said, in terms of reaching a wider potentially more diverse group of students. In the course that I'm teaching on at the moment, it's perfectly possible we'll have students from Haiti and Sudan, as we have in the past. So I think those are huge benefits. But at the same time, I mean, this whole Zoom thing, I mean, I don't know about everybody else, but it's really intensified work. It's great in many ways to be able to, you know, run events like this, but I think there's a sense within the sector that this partial digital transformation we've experienced has also led to an acceleration and an intensification of academic labor, and many students are also feeling quite enervated by it, as far as I'm aware. So these things don't necessarily come, you know, without their drawbacks, never straightforward.
All right, thank you. Next we have Morten, who wants to ask some questions.
Hi Ben, thank you so much for your presentation. Do you have a sense when we are talking about internal decision or predicting services, what is the use case when it comes to smaller universities for driving internal decisions? So I can see how you can drive decision making when you have a really large data pool, but does this work with very small organizations? So a university, let's say, that has 10,000 students.
Okay. Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, it sounds partly like a technical question, but you know, so yeah, it's possible for a, you know, Coursera with 200 million enrollments to do fairly large scale analysis, and you know, to have the sort of the scale of data available to make predictions which it can then make actionable. I'm guessing here that being a small institution as part of a larger infrastructure might allow particular forms of comparison, you know, in ways that are completely anonymized and you know, a non-individual level scale that might allow institutions to compare their performance against others. There are, for example, I'm just thinking of in the library space, you can compare what students on one course, for example, at one institution are reading and their level of engagement of reading with that, with resources assigned for another course. And then it's possible for some of these library technologies to begin making sort of automated recommendations and decisions about what students should be reading, and to sort of feedback to staff about how effective their own reading lists are. So I think seems to me there's an increasing degree of kind of comparison across institutions, which doesn't exactly address what I think you're saying, but it perhaps does allow the smaller institution to in some way be enrolled into larger data sets where certain kind of decision making powers might be possible. I'm not sure I've really answered the question.
I think that made a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Morten.
Excellent. So we still have so many questions, but somebody else raised their hand. I'm not sure who you are, Unlent, so go ahead.
Hi there. I'm Neil Lent from Edinburgh, where I'm a lecturer in university learning and teaching. And Ben, I think we've been at least in a few meetings together. But I'm also a Lancaster PhD graduate, so I'm on the mailing list for this. I was just sort of thinking about the talk, and there's a whole sort of bunch of intermeshing, I think, sort of potential, but also threat. And I'm sort of thinking about the commodification angle of this, both from the kind of commercial angle of people providing us with services and tools that, generally speaking, I think they define the use of, whether they mean to or not. I've yet to see a presentation by someone from an edtech company which, even when they explicitly say, oh, this is something you can use in your own terms, there always seems to be a, this is what this thing is for, this is how you have to use it, implied, versus the kind of experience that we want our students to have through learning, but also the kind of relationship that we want to have with our students pedagogically and institutionally. I just sort of thinking what you think about I'm thinking about a question that was in chat, which was, should we be scared? And I think the answer is yes, but maybe I'm perhaps not taking into account everything that should be. So I just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah. So I've just been working with some other colleagues in on a paper about a Google product that was very popular over the last few months, and we were trying to develop this idea of a kind of platform pedagogy that I think we were trying to address this kind of issue that you said about the kind of implied use of education technology. That yes, okay, any technology has interpretive flexibility, okay, so we don't use it exactly as intended, but they do set kind of scripts or templates that are written in the code and in the algorithms that generate some kind of increasingly an adaptive response that do not just imply a particular user, but try and steer a particular form of use as well. So there's a kind of pedagogy that is built in, encoded in these platforms. And I think back to years and years ago, a really great book by Torin Monahan, where he talks about built pedagogies. And it's specifically the book is about school architecture. And he talks about the way in which school architecture and the arrangement of classrooms and so on carries a built pedagogy, a kind of set of affordances for particular forms of pedagogical interaction and activity and so on. What we were trying to do is sort of transplant that across to the kind of platform space and say, well, what would a built pedagogy look like in a Google education platform or a Microsoft education platform and so on. And it involves things like, well, you've got now ostensibly a kind of AI following you around, tracking what you do and then trying to steer you in a particular direction. So this kind of new digitally built pedagogy is even more potentially controlling because of this kind of real-time sensory power it has for kind of both real-time tracking, but also a kind of live governing of what students do. Is it scary? Maybe it is. I mean, my interest is more whether you like this stuff or not. I think it's really important to understand how it works and how it's not just changing things at the level of kind of interaction between a teacher and a student, but at the level of how parts of the sector function overall. And I think some of those changes are transformative, but potentially not in exactly or in the positive way that some of their designers seem to assume they are, or their promoters.
So sometimes scariness can be a good thing, but thank you for that. It's great. Thanks.
Well, maybe it might catalyze some resistance. I think it was on Twitter before this. I think I suggested to someone I'll come up with some solutions, and I really haven't, but there is interesting discussion increasingly about the idea of, could we have data trusts for educational data, more robust data, ethics? What if we repurposed some of these platform technologies, not from the perspective of their designers and their advocates and promoters, but from the perspective of those affected? Could we mobilize machine learning and adaptive technologies, but from the perspective of the educators and from the perspective of the students? And those seem to me like really important discussions, which as a sector we should probably be having about how do these things work and what's their effects, but also what can we do about it? And that might involve repurposing the technologies where they might actually do some good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm just going to read out what the questions we could not get to were about, just to summarize the wealth and variety of issues that were still on the list. One is about surveillance capitalism and just, how the digitalization of education sector and higher education fit into all dynamics of the surveillance capitalism. Another is on education as a service and basically these new Netflixization, Uberization, and so on of universities. Open access examples as alternatives. So are there any alternative ways of working with digitalization besides this for-profit kind of orientation? And I should also say that it seems European Commission today is tabling the new Digital Services Act. So I'm very curious to see if they will address also data control in the platform business more generally, which might have effects, or surely to have effects also on education as any other sector. So let's see what it actually includes. I'm not sure if you want to have a very short final word, Ben, or yeah, okay, go on. Would you like to have a conclusive short thought or?
Sorry, well, I mean, the EU thing sounds interesting, and one of the interesting things about all of this is the kind of a lot of the material I've covered, there's very little recognition of national borders. You know, a lot of the stuff in the JISC piece I described is exactly the same as stuff you can read from US think tanks, which is the same as education technology and AI companies based in Southeast Asia and so on. And yet local or regional contexts and policies and issues of data control and so on clearly will shape and affect that. And I'm aware that in the European Union there is quite a strong emphasis on open education resources and some resistance to the kind of dominance of the large big tech platforms. So I don't see any of what I've described as inevitable. I think it will play out in very different ways in very different spaces. From a research perspective, what will be interesting, of course, and keep us in work, is the way in which so-called digital transformation does materialize in all sorts of different configurations, and the ways in which different digital actors, whether it's open educational resources digital actors or, you know, big global infrastructure providers, you know, to what extent do they gain a foothold in different higher education systems. My sense is maybe the British, or particularly the sort of English higher education system, I think just the UK higher education system, because I see it in Scotland too, is particularly open to private technology providers because we're living through political times where all sectors seem to be being opened up to private technology providers. And the sort of the data justice and COVID book I showed at the very beginning of my talk very clearly articulates how that's happened in relation to the health sector, not just in the UK, but really quite intensely in the UK. So I think there are indications that the UK might feel some of these digital transformations perhaps more strongly than in other European locations. But these are things that we must explore.
Yeah, definitely very under-researched area. Thank you so much, Ben. Myself and everyone here at Lancaster really...
I don't know if you've all lost me.
Hello? Well, I'm not sure what's happening with your connection again. Thank you so much for coming. Everyone also in the chat area, thanks you for a great presentation and discussion. Before we say bye, just to say that the next seminar in our series is on Wednesday, 2nd of December. It will be presented by Dr. Oksana Aficka from the Linguistics and English Language Department at Lancaster University. And the title is Bringing CLIL and EAL Classrooms, a Recipe for Educational Success. So you can find more information about it on our web pages. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.